The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Sarah Keys, FCPA FCA, is a partner in sustainability strategy at PwC Canada. With over a dozen years of work experience as a thought leader, consultant, facilitator, and auditor, Sarah is a well-recognized sustainability and climate change expert in Canada. She regularly presents to executive teams and boards of directors on the link between ESG and climate change, with financial and operational performance and long-term value. Now let's get into the episode with Sarah. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Great to be back, eventually.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Well, today we're joined by an exciting guest, Sarah Keys, ESG strategy, governance, and reporting expert, as well as sustainability partner at PwC Canada. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
John, you're getting us kicked off on today's episode, all about understanding Bill C-59 and its impact on SMEs.
Yeah, sure thing. Speaking from outside Canada, it would be useful if, as part of this question, you could just give an outline of what the Competition Act is. And then the meat of the question is, can you provide a brief overview of Bill C-59, the amendments to the Act, and what are the specific provisions in that targeting greenwashing?
Seems like a pretty simple question, doesn't it, John?
We'll find out.
I'm being a little sarcastic. That's a big thing to handle.
Absolutely. And I think, to your point, John, it's really about setting the stage and understanding before we can talk about the amendments to the Competition Act, put it in context and understand what that act actually is and who enforces it here in Canada. So the purpose of the Competition Act is really to prevent anti-competitive practices in the Canadian marketplace. And it serves really four core purposes. The first is around the efficiency and adaptability of the Canadian economy. The second is ensuring we have expanded opportunities for Canadian business participation in world markets, while also recognizing the role of foreign competition and foreign businesses operating here in Canada. The third focus area, and particular of relevance to the topics we'll talk about today, are ensuring that small and medium-sized enterprises have equitable opportunities to participate in that Canadian economy. And last but certainly not least, the Competition Act serves to provide consumers with competitive prices and product choices. And why is this important? Well, the Competition Act is set out by the government. It is enforced by an agency called the Competition Bureau. So all eyes are on the Competition Bureau now to better understand what Bill C-59 introduces. So that's a bit of the background, the Competition Act, and the role of the Competition Bureau in enforcing it. Now let's switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about what Bill C-59 introduces. What's interesting about Bill C-59 is it serves to clarify something that already existed in the Competition Act, and that is concerns around deceptive marketing practices by Canadian businesses. And so Bill C-59 serves to clarify deceptive marketing practices, specifically in the context of environmental claims and climate change mitigation claims for products and services. Why this is important? Well, this term greenwashing has become common language that we hear in the last few years, but it lacks a definition. So in many ways, what Bill C-59 is doing is clarifying what are the expectations of Canadian businesses when it comes to how they market their products and services in relation to broad environmental claims, as well as climate change specific claims. So Bill C-59, the reason we're talking about it today, it just received royal assent in June of this year, June 2024. And as I mentioned, the intent is to clarify and explicitly identify greenwashing issues. Now, as I mentioned, the focus is on these environmental and climate change mitigation claims. And I want to underscore that mitigation piece. This is really in relation to Canadian businesses as well as foreign companies operating in Canada, making claims in relation to climate change targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So a few examples, and I know we'll talk more practically about what this looks like in the day-to-day marketing of products and services. But think about terms that we've become more accustomed to being used by Canadian companies: carbon neutral, net zero, and sustainable products. And so Bill C-59 clarifies that companies cannot use these types of labels without being able to substantiate their claims before they use them in the marketing of those products and services. Two key aspects of what it takes to substantiate those claims in Bill C-59. The first is this notion of aligning with internationally recognized methodologies. And the second is using those methodologies to conduct an adequate and proper test. Now, what do those terms mean? How will they be interpreted by the Competition Bureau as it seeks to enforce Bill C-59? This remains to be seen. There's an incredible amount of uncertainty and complexity as we talk today in November 2024 about how these amendments will be enforced by the Competition Bureau, what constitutes a valid internationally recognized methodology, and what would evidence of an adequate and proper test look like. Now, last, I just want to highlight one unique aspect that I don't see as much coverage on in Bill C-59, and that is that it introduces an additional component, something called a right of private action, where an individual such as you or I, given that the Competition Act is focused on protecting the end consumer, any Canadian citizen could raise an issue to the courts claiming greenwashing under the amendments to this act in the public interest. So the idea being all they have to do to substantiate the claim as an individual is to demonstrate that it is in the public interest to get the company to substantiate those claims. This is important because it means that organizations of all sizes may actually be exposed to additional litigation and claims from individual citizens in Canada.
Thank you for that. I think that was comprehensive and understandable, which is great. In the UK, we don't have an equivalent act. We have elements that would do that. But just a sort of rider on that, I think it's really interesting, the issue about enforcement and who will be the first victim of this. And, you know, when they enforce it, will they go for somebody big who probably can defend their case more, but it will have more impact, or will they go for somebody small who may have trouble defending it, won't have so much impact? So it's going to be really interesting to, like most laws, and with your legal system being similar to ours, there's going to be precedent and how does it all develop. But I think it sounds like a really positive step forward. But it is a shame that we've had to have legislation to control the claims that people make. But why not? It happens in all other areas. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, and John, I want to pick up on what you said, and Sarah, what you conveyed too. So what was really the motivation behind these amendments? What actually stirred this and created that action for these amendments?
It's such a good question because really the issue is why now? It's not really a matter of, a surprise, I think, by the Canadian business community that, the Competition Bureau would be considering these issues. But the issue of why now is particularly because there have been an increasing number of Canadian businesses, both large and small medium enterprise, publicly traded and privately held, making claims related to environmental issues and in particular, climate change mitigation claims. And this is because since the rise of investor focus, of public focus on climate change since 2020, when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a massive uptake in corporate net zero commitments. Now, the issue is, for a commitment to be credible, they have to have a detailed plan about how they're going to get there. And that's what we've lacked in terms of the disclosure by Canadian businesses, both large and small medium enterprise, in terms of what are those detailed plans to help substantiate these pretty lofty claims that they'll achieve things like net zero by 2050, and in some cases, even 2040. Now, why this is important, particularly because we're having this conversation about Bill C-59 and amendments to the Competition Act, the same time as we continue to wait for the international financial reporting standards that are focused on sustainability to come to Canada. So the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB, have issued those final standards, and we know that regulators are evaluating and consulting on their adoption here in Canada. Had those standards been finalized earlier and adopted, we may not see the need to rule with this type of iron fist in response, because then companies would have been required to provide that disclosure about how they're going to achieve those targets, what are the costs and benefits of doing so, and what are some of the risks, opportunities, and challenges in front of them. And so it's really been this rise in voluntary corporate commitments around claiming net zero aspirations, as well as things like carbon neutrality through the purchase of carbon credits, that are being viewed as a bit of a deceptive marketing risk, and therefore clarifying in Bill C-59 on how we address it.
And so just a little further on digging a little deeper on this, was there any particular cases or industry practices that prompted this actual change? Like, is there a sector or sectors that were, I think, being looked at closely?
So the interesting thing about this bill is that it is a sweeping one in that it applies to all Canadian businesses, regardless of sector or size, and it includes foreign companies operating in Canada. So it's not targeting any specific sector. But as I've noted, Bill C-59 serves to clarify deceptive marketing practices, which are already captured in the Competition Act in the context of environmental and climate change mitigation claims, aka greenwashing. So many folks may not realize, but the Competition Bureau has had the authority to enforce deceptive marketing concerns and do investigations into Canadian companies well before Bill C-59 was introduced. In 2022, the Competition Bureau launched an investigation into alleged false and misleading environmental representations by the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC Bank, one of our household names and one of our major banks in this country, obviously a large publicly traded company. But this was really around the distinction of RBC continuing to lend to high-emitting sectors like oil and gas and mining, while at the same time setting out lofty ambitions for net zero lending by 2050 across their investment portfolio. And why is this so important? Because RBC was made an example in Canada in 2022. And it did get a lot of attention. The reputational impacts of a Competition Bureau investigation alone are significant. And as you noted, Dave, some of these larger organizations, they also have a lot more resources to help substantiate and back up those claims. And they would have been one of the organizations leading the way in terms of their voluntary reporting in alignment with some of those best practices, those internationally recognized methodologies and standards that are likely to be referenced by the Competition Bureau in their upcoming guidance. But it wasn't just banking that got caught out. In 2024, a similar investigation was launched by the Competition Bureau against Lululemon. And so this is a consumer packaged goods, a household name company that we know here in Canada, manufacturing garments and equipment, active wear. And so Lululemon has also been a leader in Canada in terms of setting some of these decarbonization targets, making lofty claims to reduce emissions over time, including in their Scope 3. And that's really what caught Lululemon out. It was really the distinction between their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, those within the company's control, versus their Scope 3 emissions, which are included in their targets, but are starting to skyrocket as the company continues to grow and expand. So 2 examples of cases that were put in place and launched, investigations launched by the Competition Bureau before Bill C-59 even came into play.
Thank you for that, sir.
Yes, Sarah, you said that the Act covers all sizes of business, SMEs, large, etc. So, but how might these regulations impact SMEs differently to the large corporations?
You know, I think, John, one of the most important things we have to recognize is, particularly in Canada, 99% of our businesses are small, medium enterprise. So while we have seen the public examples being made of large corporations like RBC and Lululemon, it's critical that small, medium enterprises pay close attention not only to the amendments for Bill C-59 to the Competition Act, but more importantly, how the Competition Bureau produces guidance to help companies understand what they must do to stay on side of these new rules. Now, the Competition Act applies to all businesses operating in Canada with very few exceptions. So SMEs really need to pay attention to what is required before they make environmental or climate change mitigation claims related to products or services. Because this is focused on deceptive marketing practices, any labeling that's going out on small, medium enterprise products really needs to be substantiated using internationally recognized methodologies and an adequate and proper test. The real kicker here is SMEs should be doing this before any claims are made. And to date, what we've seen is a lot of companies making the claims and coming up with plans thereafter to achieve them. In the new world, with the clarifications and amendments to Bill C-59, that approach poses far more risks to a company than it does opportunities. So really important that we don't let our marketing and communications, public relations teams run away marketing about environmental and climate change mitigation claims without having that adequate and proper testing, appropriate documentation, and alignment with internationally recognized methodologies. And now what those are remains to be clarified from the Competition Bureau, and that's a really important point.
On that note, Sarah, what practical steps can SMEs take to ensure their environmental and climate claims are compliant and authentic?
So realistically, I would hope that all Canadian businesses, including SMEs, shouldn't have been engaging knowingly in deceptive marketing practices. So assuming no intentional wrongdoing, there shouldn't be a huge burden added to SMEs. However, what I'd like to see is SMEs planning to use environmental and climate change claims to actually differentiate their products and services. They need to build this into their planning and documentation before these claims are made. So if your marketing, communications, or PR team is planning for this, or they've already made claims, you really need to quickly review what is publicly out there and how the Competition Bureau might interpret it. So some of the practical steps I'd like to see SMEs taking to ensure their environmental and climate change are both compliant with the new provisions of Bill C-59, but also authentic to the stakeholders you're trying to communicate to. There are a few things to start with. So my first tip is take a look at what you've already got out there in terms of environmental and climate claims for your products and services, and make sure there is proper documentation and testing. If you can't substantiate in a reliable way any of the claims that you've already made publicly, remove these claims immediately to avoid additional risks. I also want to underscore that companies, particularly SMEs, should beware of the trap of using carbon credits to claim carbon neutrality. This is a contentious issue for which internationally recognized methodologies continue to struggle in determining the role of carbon credits in achieving net zero and carbon neutrality. So be very careful about using carbon credits in this way. As you develop new claims for products and services, I highly recommend you align your testing with the following international methodologies that are really going to be the backbone of the disclosure and reporting standards. And that is the standards of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the forthcoming finalized standards of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, which are based on the ISSB standards, and from a more technical perspective, aligning claims around science-based targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative's methodologies. And finally, when it comes to calculating your greenhouse gas emissions and reductions therein, using the Global Greenhouse Gas Protocol to drive those calculations. The other thing I would say is SMEs should err on the side of caution when making their claims, meaning be more conservative. Do not overstate or embellish. Sorry, there's a siren in the background. It's Toronto Life. Okay, I'll come to my last couple pieces here. Using terms that are well defined and well understood and referenced in the standards is another careful way to ensure you're not engaging in deceptive marketing practices inadvertently. And finally, if your organization has already made a net zero claim or it intends to, please ensure you're developing a comprehensive transition plan using guidance from the Transition Plan Task Force and Climate Engagement Canada to ensure that these claims can be substantiated. These are really the internationally recognized methodologies that are being used in the capital markets, and therefore they will inform the disclosure standards, and aligning to these frameworks will help SMEs reduce their ultimate reporting burden over time.
Sarah, a follow-up question. Based on this legislation, what evidence or what are you seeing that corporations are doing now in making modifications or correcting to ensure that they're following through with this legislation?
What's really interesting, Dave, is the market response to this. And so almost immediately, we saw the most significant action to remove voluntary disclosures and all net zero related documentation by the oil and gas sector in Canada. Most notably, the Oil Sands Alliance, which was focused on the 5 largest producers in Canada, scrubbed their website entirely of all items related to net zero and the goal of achieving net zero with this alliance, and quickly replaced it with a set of detailed legal jargon to explain that the risks posed by Bill C-59 actually exceed the benefits of providing this voluntary disclosure, and indicating that the alliance and its members, the 5 largest oil and gas producers in Canada, who also scrubbed their websites of their voluntary reporting, think Imperial Oil, Cenovus, Suncor Energy, who have been leaders in voluntary sustainability reporting for decades, all pulling it back, saying they are waiting for further clarification and guidance from the Competition Bureau on how they will enforce Bill C-59 amendments. And Dave, I have to be honest with you, why might they be doing this? Well, the penalties are significant. For a non-compliance with Bill C-59, if you are found guilty of deceptive marketing, particularly for greenwashing, it can be up to $10 million initial fine and 3% of annual gross worldwide revenues. So this is material, real teeth. It's catching companies' attention. And of course, oil and gas companies who are both critical to this transition, but significant emitters in this country, are caught in this tension of not quite understanding how they're expected to navigate this complexity and strike that right balance.
That's a very powerful motivation to make sure you've got this right, Sarah, for sure.
Sarah, thanks for a great episode on understanding Bill C-59 and its impact. To end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
So my key takeaway is that Bill C-59 is a clarification bill. It's clarifying deceptive marketing practices in the context of environmental and climate change mitigation claims. But companies shouldn't have ever been knowingly engaging in greenwashing to their stakeholders. So use this new guidance that will be forthcoming from the Competition Bureau to help inform how you approach developing credible and authentic claims, staying on side of your investors, customers, and importantly in this case, your regulators.
Thanks for that, Sarah. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, there's a variety of takeaways there could be. And I thought it was interesting that Sarah's touched on the fact of some people being, shall we say, acting quickly and removing voluntary disclosure because they're not sure what the rules are. And I think in the short term, this could have both positive and negative effects, in as much that some observers will go, people aren't interested in this anymore, they're removing it. But on the other hand, when it comes back, which we hope it does, it will be more robust.
Thanks for that, John. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
It's similar to John. I think effectively what this is it's a reboot. It's actually ensuring that when people are doing things, there's a plan, as Sarah conveyed, versus being reactive and throwing stuff to the wall. It's actually going to have a plan that has some rigor that actually people will implement and probably implement more successfully and get more results and returns. And so I'm hopeful that people will take it that way versus, this is more regulation that actually is going to stop us from doing something. I think it can be very positive if people use it appropriately.
Thanks for that. Dave, John, Sarah, thanks for a great episode.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was a good one.
Very helpful, Sarah. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.